Yes, perhaps I shall, because you are so young, so you never experienced the system before new public management. And perhaps I now talk to the Swedes first of all, because in Sweden, before you could say that 1984 was the year when this sort of new public management was introduced first in Sweden on the Congress of the Employers Organization in Sweden. And before that, you could say that the healthcare system, the school system, the children's care system, the elderly care system, all were publicly organized. The public sector owned all the hospitals, all the schools, and so on. And it was financed on the whole via taxes. Healthcare also was financed by the social security system, the social insurance system, sick care social insurance system. So this thing that you could choose the school where you want to send your children, that was my children, for instance, they were sent to the school in the neighborhood. And there they could meet all sorts of people living in the surrounding. Of course, we lived in a segregated society, but I happened to live in a part of this town, Guldheden, some of your Göteborgare know what it is, where it was fairly class mixed up. In the beginning it was a typical working class area, but now the later people like me came in. So the children in my children's classes were quite mixed up, and they still have friends from working class and so on. And today it's extremely different. Well, I'll come back to that. But anyway, in 1984, the first private childcare organization came. It was called Pysslingen. You don't know Swedish, some of you. So Pysslingen, it's a sort of. How would you translate Pysslingen to English? Hmm?
No. Leprechaun.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, perhaps. Yeah. Well, anyway, it was a very big debate. The Prime Minister Olof Palme was very upset about this. Should we really accept that you can have this in private? But then you could say that in the beginning of the 90s, and that was when the moderate-led government came in 1991. Then this new system was introduced where you had a right to start private firms, organize schools and hospitals and elderly care and children's care, and then the municipalities, svenska kommuner, they had to pay from tax money and buy, so to say, the services from those private institutions. So you had a competition between publicly owned healthcare centrals and privately owned. And in the beginning it was not so many private firms delivering healthcare and schools and so on, but it grew more and more. But the idea was to mimic the private capitalist market, to reach efficiency, so that, for instance, if a school had a very big bureaucracy or a hospital, very inefficient, then a private entrepreneur should step in and deliver those same services in a more efficient way, with not so many people working in the system perhaps, or just organized better and so on. And I think it's perhaps fair to say that in United Kingdom under Thatcher in the beginning, because the public sector was rather bureaucratized in England as in Sweden. So in the beginning it was a little of a success story. The efficiency was increased. But we'll come to that later. That was more in the beginning, not later. And still, the system was financed via taxes and social insurance. The next step. Oh, I'm sorry. I took a step too fast. The first step, this is what I described, was the second step. The first step was to introduce in the public sector, without private firms, a system where different parts of the public sector bought from other parts of the public sector. For instance, this university, if the university needed, or this department needed to hire Kenneth here to film the lecture, they had to pay Handelshögskolan, where Kenneth normally works, and perhaps also different producers could send a person like Kenneth, but then the bidder, the lowest bidder, would get this task to film this lecture. Understand? So the idea in the beginning was just to introduce the market mechanism and competition within the public sector, without private actors and institutions. And the second step that I just described was to allow private firms to compete with public institutions on the supply side, but the system is still financed by taxes and social insurance. And then the third big step was to only finance taxes, finance basic needs with taxes and social insurance. You could say that it's a little similar to Standing's basic income idea, but then the rest you leave to the market. Privatize both on the supply side and on the demand side, so to say. Well, nowhere. You could say that the United States has been for a very long time in this area of the third step. In the United States, you know, after lots of fights, the Obama government managed to implement a new, more general sick care system. But still, most of this system is administered, the finance is made by private insurance companies. And then the federal government ensures that everyone should have a sort of basic insurance. And it has been for many, many years now a very big discussion of, is this a success or not? And as I said, you could say that in the beginning it was evident that a certain efficiency was reached. But in the long run, I think I dare say that the systems were a disappointment. In Sweden, in 2011, an organization called the SNS. It's a sort of think tank, very close to the employers' organization. So it's normally seen as a sort of defender of more of private entrepreneurships and so on. But this very thorough investigation showed, its name in Swedish is konkurrensens konsekvenser, the consequences of competition, showed that it wasn't any success. I mean, you can't show that this new system was more efficient than the old system. And one of the problems was that the politicians never succeeded to give clear sort of conditions for the private firms going into this system. For instance, in Sweden we have a big discussion, should you have a right as a risk capitalist, so-called, to establish a school, for instance, and then take out the profit and send the profit to a tax haven. It has been some such cases. And also other famous discussions have been that in some private firms, also in some public institutions, you had different sorts of scandals that, for instance, they had too little of personnel and a very low quality in the it has been in elderly care especially, but also in healthcare in some schools. And now the government, Swedish government, has made an agreement with the left party, my party, that they are now seeing if they will change the system so that you can't take out profits, because Sweden has the most liberal system in the world. If you get it right, even if your activity is financed by taxes, you have the right to have a profit and they take out the money. And for instance, in Norway and other Nordic countries, this is not so liberal. So perhaps this system is going to be changed, but it's very unclear because the government and the left party haven't gotten a majority of their own in the Swedish parliament, so nothing perhaps will happen. But also the WHO have compared the efficiency in different systems. And in a number of reports they have shown that the United States system is very expensive because of these private insurance firms. They have lots of resources to investigate into if the different patients really have the right to get out the insurance. So it's a very bureaucratic system, more bureaucratic even than the old sort of public sector sort of organization. Okay. So my conclusion is that if you have problems on the national level to take out higher taxes because of mobile tax bases, and if you have problems to make the public sector very much more efficient, and you have this Bomols cost disease problem that healthcare, education and so on always gets more and more expensive compared to private consumption or private production of material goods, then the solution must be to have international taxation in order to save the welfare states. You must have some sort of international cooperation at least. And if I go back to Piketty, he says too that we need a tax on capital that would promote the general interest over private interest while preserving economic openness and the forces of competition. We need a progressive global tax on wealth. This is an extremely controversial proposition, and lots of politicians all over the world, not to speak about all those economists, have been very much against. It's absurd. How should you organize this? We haven't got the instruments, the power to develop this. And also Piketty writes about the system, the tax havens. They defend bank secrecy in that it allows their clients to evade their fiscal obligations. The most thoroughgoing attempt to end these practices is the Foreign Tax Compliance Act, FATCA, adopted in the US. This is really a paradox. US, that is normally seen as the most sort of capitalist country in the world, perhaps. They have a new law implemented now. It's actually this year that this new law really is implemented. And it says that all foreign banks must inform the Treasury Department in the US about bank accounts and investments held abroad by US taxpayers. But the US, how could they demand from, for instance, the banks in Switzerland or Singapore or some other country with low taxes to implement this law, United States law? Well, they can threaten them. The United States has said that if you don't comply to our new system, then we will break all sorts of economic relations with you. And actually it has been quite efficient. Switzerland and Singapore have, both of them, complied on the whole. It's still a big discussion if they are really going to make it efficient, but it has been a development. And also Piketty writes, this is a far more ambitious law than the EU directive on foreign savings, which concerns only interest-bearing deposits and applies only to European banks. EU governments must already possess something close to proof of fraud in order to obtain information about the foreign bank accounts of one of its citizens. A problem discussed in the European Parliament is also that Jean-Claude Juncker, the present president of the EU Commission, he is the former leader in Luxembourg, one of the sort of tax havens. And in Luxembourg they have developed a system to inform foreign firms and private individuals how they can come to Luxembourg and put their money there, and they are not running the risk that Luxembourg will leave out their name and bank accounts. So will Juncker really accept this sort of law in European Union? And of course, even if we get this sort of law in European Union as in the United States, then you have the rest of the world. Will rich people leave United States and Europe and go to China or Saudi Arabia? So the problem is, of course, that you really need a sort of global cooperation with every big actor in this new system. Well, this is about taxing income taxes and perhaps also wealth taxes. But we have also green taxes. And Gunilla talked about this with you. Here is my colleague at the Department of Economics, Thomas Sterner. He has been a member of this intergovernmental panel of climate change. And he has made a report just a couple of months ago. It was published. And there he says, one potentially strong policy instrument is to make emitters of CO2, a greenhouse gas, the most important greenhouse gas, pay a price in relation to the amount emitted. But it all hinges on this price being sufficiently high. In most countries, there is virtually no cost to emitting CO2 and other greenhouse gases. At the same time, studies show that if a sufficiently high emission tax of about $1.15 per kilo CO2 or an equivalent per bit trading scheme were introduced across the world, the total emissions could be reduced by half by 2050. So this would be a very efficient way to bring down this threatening risk of a climate disaster. But is it possible? I mean, for Obama, who is now quite progressive in those green questions, to say to the American taxpayers that you must pay European level of taxes on petrol with this new president candidate for the Republican Donald Trump, who would very aggressively say that don't touch our petrol taxes. It's not easy, but if United States, Thomas has in another paper shown that if United States raised their petrol taxes to the same level as the European average, that would be a very, very big step towards the solution of the greenhouse gas climate change problem. So, it's of course the big difficulty is how to make strong international agreements, how to get US and China and India and Brazil and so on to accept at least a sort of minimum tax on greenhouse gases. Then, if you remember, Gunilla said something about those trading, emission permit, trading with permission to emit different things like greenhouse gases. And now I will go into a quite controversial theme. I heard a lecture here, it was an European conference on green environmental economic policies. And I heard a man talking about the sulfur, emissions of sulfur in United States industry. And he showed that this system of emission permits introduced in the United States some 15 years ago was extremely efficient to bring down sulfur emissions. Because, he said, that the technique was very well known. So it was very easy for the companies to handle this technical change. And also the cost to emit was put quite high, so it was quite expensive to emit sulfur. But on the other hand, when in Europe this sort of scheme was introduced for greenhouse gases, that was a failure, and probably mostly because the cost of the emissions was put too low. So still there is an opinion among people like Gunilla, as you heard, calling themselves ecological economists, that to be against this sort of nature is too fundamental, you can't put nature on the market, so to say. And here is a man, I don't know if you should call him some sort of neoliberal. I don't think so, not so extremely. But he has written a book where he describes one of the big disasters, environmental disasters in the world. The history was that cotton growers in Uzbekistan benefited from free water, which they used in such abundance that the Aral Sea fed from the rivers Surdarya and Amudarya, I think the name of the rivers was, that were now dammed for irrigation, shrank to half of its surface and a third of its volume in less than 30 years. It left behind a great bowl of salt-encrusted, chemically polluted, infertile land. This was Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader in Soviet Union in the beginning of the 60s. He says, we will pass the United States in GDP per capita. And he introduced those extreme big schemes to develop cotton growers in Uzbekistan. That was then a part of the Soviet Union. And the water was free. They didn't pay anything for the water. So the result was this, and that is a photo that I have taken myself because I was there. And it's a horrible, horrible, horrible situation. The people can't barely survive there. It was a small town, lots of fishing boats, and very, very good sort of nature. But now it's a barren, salt, and people can't. Very big difficult to survive. So one of the basic problems was that water was free. He writes, Seabright, romantic conservatives throughout the ages, like Edmund Burke, who said that the age of chivalry is gone and that of economists and calculators have succeeded. Burke, he wrote the book Against the French Revolution. He was a British conservative. And now some of the high-minded critics of globalization have disdained the commercial spirit as vulgar. So he actually says that you must introduce economic motives, an economic price on natural resources, also water, in order to handle the climate crisis. And in my opinion, on the whole, the historical experience is that economic instruments have been more efficient to contribute to a sustainable development compared to administrative measures. When I was in the parliament, we made an agreement with the Social Democratic Party and the Green Party to have a tax exchange, it was called. We raised taxes, green taxes on petrol and other things, and we lowered taxes on work. It was 40 billion Swedish crowns over a 10 years period, and it was a big opposition. The bourgeois parties were very much against this scheme, but we did it for a number of years. We couldn't do it for 10 years because the right-wing government took over in 2006. And this scheme was introduced in 1998. But I would say that it was, to a certain amount, it was successful. We brought down, compared to what would have happened otherwise, the pollution and environmental problems to a certain extent. And this was much more efficient than sort of to forbid certain things and try to administrate plans for a better environment. Also, I can take this city as an example. When I was in the parliament, one of the main questions that we and the Green Party had was to introduce taxes for cars in the big cities, what is called trängselskatt now in Gothenburg, very controversial. And I would say that this is a much more efficient way to bring down car traffic in the center of Gothenburg compared to all those planning measures taken to organize the streets in different ways. Those instruments are more efficient, I say. And I also say that we must have not only local solutions as this one in Gothenburg, we also must have international, global solutions. Taxes, subsidies, emission tradings to handle climate change and other problems that Gunilla talked about. But these are controversial statements, and what do you think? It's too hard a question. Well, I can take the rest. We have another problem. Oh, perhaps it's not only a problem, it's also something with a lots of positive aspects, but we have a growing number of migrants to the European welfare states, and it's mostly described in the media as a big problem for us. But I would say it's a much bigger problem for the countries from where the migrants come. Many of them are young and have an education paid by the taxpayers there. And this means a brain drain with negative long-run consequences for those countries. Some of the migrants return home, and most of them staying send home money to their relatives. But even so, lots of studies show that immigration in the long run means socioeconomic surplus for us, not for them. I have another colleague here in Göteborg, Joachim Rust. He has made calculation over the sort of social economic plus and minus of immigration to Sweden. And he shows that in the short run, it's more costs than benefits. But in the long run, it's extremely clear that it's a surplus for the Swedish people as a whole, because we need young people coming here, because we are aging. So it's a much bigger problem for Syria or Iraq, that the most brilliant persons, many of them very well educated, and perhaps also smart, because you must be smart in order to get here. So the conclusion is for me that we need some sort of global solutions, some sort of agreements, how to compensate, how the rich countries like United States or Sweden, who gets all those benefits, should we perhaps pay back some of the money that the cost of the education for those people coming here, perhaps some of you, should we pay that back to those countries, taxpayers that paid for your education? And healthcare, it's the same. We need global solutions. In April 2015, the World Bank said that the Ebola crisis means that Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone will lose at least $2.2 billion in foregone economic growth in 2015. It's evident that apart from the moral aspect, richer countries has a self-interest to help finance the control of Ebola. The World Health Organization is developing a plan for a new pandemic emergency facility that would enable resources to flow quickly when outbreaks occurs. But who will pay for that? Now, Bill Gates is one of the big contributors. WHO is dependent on a big fund financed by Bill Gates, and that can't be something that holds for in the long run, to be dependent on private individuals. And there's another man, Danny Roderick. I have a text on the course list. The political trilemma of the world economy. We cannot simultaneously pursue democracy, national determination, and economic globalization, even though it's possible to advance both democracy and globalization. The trilemma suggests this requires the creation of a global political community that is vastly more ambitious than anything we have seen to date. And this World Value Survey, a big sociological investigation, global, revealed that attachment to the nation states overwhelms all other forms of identity. Probably you call yourselves, I am a Swede, I am a something else. Or I try to call myself a citizen of the world, but the national identity is still very strong. And then we have resistance against some sort of supranational democracy. A German, Wolfgang Streeck, quite famous among leftist circles especially, he has written a book, Buying Time. The European Monetary Union was a political mistake. Yes, I can agree. We may undo the euro and return to an orderly system of flexible exchange rates. This regime would put an end to the coalition between the export countries in the north and the middle classes of the south, which at present allows the rich in the south to buy German luxury cars and cut wages and pensions for the poor. An exit from the euro would mean to reject a sort of globalization that subjects the world to a uniform law of the market. Democracy cannot be had without state sovereignty. A strategy that places the hopes in post-national democracy merely plays into the hands of the social engineers of self-regulating global market capitalism. I feel that he attacks me when he says this. And this is he is not alone. Lots of people, especially from the, well, I would say first of all from the extreme right, but also from the left, say that we must return to the national states. That's the only democratic body we have. What do you think? I will just have one last, and then you can say something. In my opinion, this is my subjective opinion, it's a very delicate matter to find a balance between different interests if the aim is to foster democratic, egalitarian, feminist and ecologist values in the restructuring of the global institutional setting. In certain cases, the global system must be given the right to intervene against national interests. The fundamental condition for this, in my view, is that the principle of world citizenship, one individual, one vote, gradually becomes the leading principle in a global constitution. A directly elected global democratic body, a world parliament. I will never survive to see it, but perhaps you will fix this in 50 years or so. Am I right? Most of my friends think that I am an utopian cracknut. But it's up to you more than to me what will happen in the future. Now you must say something. Am I a cracknut?
I would like to go back to Streeck, one slide earlier, I think it was. He proposes the idea to go back to national currencies. What about the idea of Keynes of a global currency?
Well, I think that's a very good thing. And you must remember that Keynes' proposition was not to abolish all the national currencies, but to have also a global currency. And to my big astonishment, the director of the Chinese central bank was out some year ago and said that we need a global currency because of this situation that I described in one earlier lecture about still the dollar dominance, and United States is still sort of a power central for global capital and money. So a global currency would be very good element in such a sort of global democratic structure, yes. And also Streeck's idea to go back. We have this discussion in Greece now also. Some persons in Greece, those people who broke out from the government party Syriza, they want to get rid, or also the Communist Party of Greece, they want to go back to the drachma, the Greek currency. But I believe, like Paul Krugman, that it's a big risk that such a development, even if it was a mistake from the beginning to construct this currency union, I think it could be a disaster to break down the system. It's very difficult to dismantle the system, and it's a clear risk that we'll go back to a situation similar to the 1930s when the countries started to close down, and it would be more sort of aggressions between the different European states. So I think I'm not on Streeck's side here in this question. Well, yeah.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical about this idea of a global currency, and also very skeptical of the euro. I mean, if you go to a global currency, it depends very much on the sort of design of this currency and who has the power to print money, as in the current situation with the euro and every national currency. Those who are creating money are not just central banks but commercial banks, right? So wouldn't it be more like concentrating power if you create a global currency, depending on how you design it?
Yes, depending on, just as you say, because who is the strong player today concerning the global currency system? That I would say it's the United States government and central bank who has a very big say over the global currency system.
Private financial institutions very much.
Yes, but United States still dominates Monetary Fund and World Bank because of the rules, because the biggest payer has the biggest power. So the condition for this global currency is, of course, that you have some sort of democratic institution that is democratically elected.
But that was the idea from the beginning with the Bretton Woods institutions, with IMF and the World Bank, as Keynes thought
Yes.
about it from the beginning.
Yes, yes.
And how it has developed now, it has corrupted. And also I think, going back to the discussion, leaving the drachma or staying the euro, I'm completely for leaving the euro in this sense, because then you have some sort of financial sovereignty, you know, to,
You haven't.
to create your own.
You are, even if you leave, I mean, you have lots of countries outside the euro in Europe, like Sweden. We haven't got so much of a sort of freedom to act as we wish. We are slaves under the big banks and finance capitals, even if we are not even if we are outside the euro. So I think it's a little of an illusion that we will have so much power, more power, if we leave the euro.
I agree with you, but you're not in a Greek situation right now. That's the point.
Yes, that's the point, and I'm very glad. I voted no 2003. I am very glad that Sweden kept outside, but that's another thing in Greece today, to go back. It's a very big problem, I think. So I understand the arguments for the Greeks who wants to stay in there. But anyway, I mean, the important thing is that we can discuss this, you and me. If we sit in the World Parliament, you can say your thing and I can say mine.
May I jump to another topic? Yeah, of course, because it's an endless discussion, this. If I may jump back to the topic when you brought up the example about Uzbekistan, and you know, if things should have a price, if you should put a price on nature, what sort of mechanisms, market mechanisms should we adopt, and so on. I mean, the guy was clearly referring to this idea of the tragedy of the commons, right? And so you have like common pool resources that everybody can use, people will just deplete it and not take care of it. But that's an idea that I think it has proven to be wrong. You have a famous example, the Nobel Prize winner, you know her, Ostrom.
I've talked a little about her.
Yeah. Governance of common pool resources. So I think we should maybe focus more on the idea of, you know, community governance of common pool resources. Not everything should be, you know, arranged through market mechanisms and the price system.
Absolutely.
And we should be empowering communities.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I mean, and I agree, you know, either you're thinking about private actors or state bureaucracies, they all like top-down solutions somehow.
I totally agree. I'm a fundamentalist, sort of Ostrom follower and cooperativist. I think the main solution is to form local communities handling the commons. But observe that also when Ostrom describes the mechanisms within those commons, you have lots of economic instruments also. You don't get rid of the money, or when people pay to each other different prices for natural resources and so on. It's just that she says that people can themselves find the good solutions to handle the commons. And I say that even if this is the basic solution, you also need certain global solutions on certain global problems, like the climate change problems. You can't fix that without some sort of global agreement.
Yeah, interesting to hear your opinions about the Tobin tax proposition.
When I was in the parliament, I made a motion to introduce the Tobin tax, or rather that the Swedish government should work for introducing the global Tobin tax. Of course, the answer was no, but I think that, as I said, I think the last lecture, 11 European states have now said that they want to have a Tobin tax on the European level. I think they have very big difficulties to implement it because the forces against are very strong, and I think it's a very long way to go in order to get the United States and China and so on this boat. But it's a very good proposition. His idea, Tobin's idea, was to have a little lower degree of mobility of money. That would stabilize the world economy, I think. And also you get in certain money to spend on important global investments. So I'm very positive. Okay, now we have perhaps reached, I will meet you once more when we have some sort of discussion in the end with Scholt and the other teachers. So then you can come back and attack us or whatever you want.